For coming, would you like to state your full name, title, position and swear either an oath or an affirmation, please?
Certainly. Adam Lindsay, Executive Director of Sydney Living Museums. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you, and thanks very much for coming again. We had a little bit of a foul up earlier, which you might have got a repeat performance on, but we managed to fix the technical hitch, so we're running a little bit late, but would you care to make an opening statement?
A very brief one, if I may.
Yeah, please.
I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're here today on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to Elders past, present and future. My name, as I've said, is Adam Lindsay. I'm the Executive Director of Sydney Living Museums, and it's in that capacity that I've been called here today to speak before the committee. For the record, I'll declare that I'm also Executive Director of New South Wales State Archives, and note that I haven't been called here today to speak in that capacity.
Sorry, say that again.
I'll note that I've been called here to speak as on behalf of and with evidence pertaining to Sydney Living Museums.
You might just pull the microphone a little closer.
Sorry about that.
That's better.
But I haven't been called here in my capacity, and I'm not prepared to answer questions about New South Wales State Archives, although we'd be very prepared to take them on notice if needed.
Yeah, well, we'd be happy for you to take them on notice if you don't want to answer them here. But,
It's more around preparation for figures and whatnot.
No, please.
That's
Oh, no. There's a lot of people who come and give evidence who aren't particularly prepared. Not that I'm being critical at all, but...
Okay. Was that your opening statement done?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. Questions?
Mr. Lindsay, now I understand that in your organisation, that staff have been alerted to changes to their roles, titles, and responsibilities. What prompted that to occur?
Regular business. There's constant need for change and to be more efficient and effective. But what prompted the latest round of organisational changes was the partnership between Sydney Living Museums and New South Wales State Archives. As of the 1st of July 2019, they came under one executive director, being myself.
Yep.
And so we took the opportunity in a staged approach, a non-industrial staged approach, to amalgamate some functions across the two entities to increase efficiencies. Things like back of house services, finance, HR, IT, and that was the first round of changes. The latest that I think you're referring to that was in the media was centralising management of capital works across New South Wales State Archives and Sydney Living Museums. There's two levels to the changes really. In both entities, capital expenditure and works were being done in multiple teams, so they were consolidated into one team, and that was joined as a single team to make sure that we had standard procurement functions, we could get better value going to market for similar services as a combined approach.
Did that result in a reduction of staff?
No,
Not at all.
none at all.
So if it resulted in, I guess, a streamlining or duplication, what did the staff who found that they, in fact, that their duties were sort of folded into another person's position, what did those people move on to?
Well, in the first instance, nothing, because New South Wales State Archives previously outsourced all its shared services, finance, IT, HR. So when we combined with Sydney Living Museums, back of house functions, we added people to the Sydney Living Museums team to enable them to cover both entities and stopped outsourcing at New South Wales State Archives. So there wasn't, if you will, the comparable position, so there were no spills and fills. The only exception to that, there were two IT managers in both entities, but they were at different classifications. So we simply combined the teams and worked out who would do what duties. So now there's a head of IT that came from the SARA entity, and there was a head of IT but at a lower grade at the SLM entity, and now they're simply in one team.
So what is the name of the merged activity or the merged facilities? What is that called?
Well, it remains two separate entities legally and in statute, and it operates under two very clear governance structures, and so it has its own single employees, but where we have been able to combine certain functions to get better value, we've done so. But each employee continues to remain an employee of one or other of the entities. They're simply doing duties and fulfilling roles across two. So it sounds more complicated than it is. Some of them are purely administrative on whose establishment you're on, but it's the combining of functions to enable better outcomes.
So what was the end result in a cost-benefit analysis? What was it, I guess, what were the savings made?
Well, in New South Wales State Archives, we're paying significantly less for our shared services when they come out of SLM than when we outsource them. A figure of about 500,000 from memory.
Wow.
And then in the capital, because we get a standard capital grant from government and we need to expend that, there's no savings. It's just we get more for the buying power by combining the teams. So when we're going out for air conditioning upgrades, instead of New South Wales State Archives procuring it and SLM procuring it, we're probably able to get a better rate by combining those two and giving the one supplier both jobs, and also less staff overheads to run two procurement processes. So the capital savings haven't resulted in a net benefit to the bottom line. They've simply resulted in more capital going to service upgrades and less to staff management.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Lindsay, it must be a pretty tough time to be running museums with the COVID-19 impact. Do you want to just give us a summary of where you're up to and what your plans are?
Yes, certainly. Look, it has been tough. I suppose there's two aspects to it. There's the museum not really being a museum when it's not open to the public, and that's always tough for vocational workplaces not to be able to show off the collections and intellectual property that they're producing. So the staff morale has been, an interesting one. In terms of revenue, it's been tough because Sydney Living Museums gets the majority of its self-generated regular revenue from ticket sales, exhibition sales, public program sales, and then also functions. We have some of the most spectacular function venues in the state. I'll do a sales pitch for that. And so it's a significant line of revenue. So in terms of coping with that, the revenue impacts, we're still feeling them because even though we're reopening, it's at a reduced capacity. But in terms of management, we did a number of things quite quickly. First of all, we put into place a skills marketplace, and that basically allowed anyone who'd had their job or the duties reduced by COVID to log their capacity and their self-assessed skills in this virtual marketplace. Leaders in the organisation were then able to log a work package and say, I need this done, it should take this amount of time, and it needs these skills. HR would then match them up and then assign that via their leader to attest that they had those skills and indeed had that capacity. And then we were able to engage workers from all over the organisation in the highest priority work for the entity. So as a result of that, we didn't need to lay anybody off. Casuals ceased to get shifts because they are simply employed to generate profitable revenue, and if that revenue is not there, we can't engage casuals. But anyone who was on a permanent or even temporary public service contract has not had that contract ended early and have been involved in productive work. So we've managed to keep staff morale and productivity up in those senses, and like many institutions have converted a lot of our offering to either digital in the interim or now a hybrid of physical and digital.
So what proportion of your workforce was casual
There was
prior to COVID?
Prior to COVID, there was probably anywhere between 30 and 60 casuals out of an establishment of about 180.
So between 15 and 30?
15 and
to
20,
30%.
yeah, at the very most. I mean, it is driven by, if we've got a function every night in summer, obviously the number of casuals we need increases exponentially. So normalised over a year, I'd say under 30%, but probably between 20 and 25.
And have you had any ongoing contact with that contingent labour force? What's your...
Yes.
Obviously been tough on them. What's your proposal for that
Well,
casual labour force?
when function revenue starts to return, they'll be employed again. I suppose it's been difficult because the choice has been there's not enough work and revenue to pay for the entire workforce, irrespective of the nature of your employment. So the choice was keep casuals in ongoing regular employment or irregular employment and end temporary contracts for public servants, or vice versa, and we've chosen that latter option. We have regular contact with them. They're still on the books as employees. They still receive all employee communications, and every time work comes in, be it an education program where casuals are a rich source of labour for us, or function, and we've done quite a lot of filming during COVID, we often employ casuals in that capacity. We've just had word from the Education Department that excursions will be reinstated in Term 4, and that is where the predominant amount of our casuals are employed. So we're awaiting the guidelines and whether we can accommodate that, and as soon as we are able to, casuals will return to our workforce.
And in terms of the size of the budget hit, I mean, you would have finalised your 2020 annual reporting. Can you give us an indication of what the budget hit has been for Sydney Living Museums and how you're going to deal with it?
So the budget hit, it only came in the last couple of months, so we had fairly decent revenue up until March. We didn't have an enormous deviation from budget. I'll look for the figures while I'm answering the question. But we're really concentrating on philanthropy and we're concentrating on corporate sponsorship. I have to say our corporate sponsors have been fantastic during COVID. For Sydney Open, we've had probably more sponsors than we've had previously. So we've done very, very well in corporate sponsorship and philanthropy. But museum ticket clippings, exhibition entry and general function revenue has continued to decline.
I'm more than happy to hear the good news part of the story, by the way, Mr. Lindsay.
Good. So I will just find the deviation from budget here. So our self-generated revenue from FY19 to FY20 reduced just over $600,000.
And what are your projections for the current financial year?
That's a difficult question because the state budget hasn't been finalised yet. We're still operating on a half-year appropriation. So it's difficult to say. Revenue's starting to come back with restrictions being lifted, and we're certainly stimulating a lot of self-generated revenue, more than our projections, albeit our projections are significantly down on last year. So yet to know until the state government finalise the budget for this year.
And in terms of what's going to impact upon your revenue or not, border openings and border closures,
Yes.
Are they going to have an impact on your revenue? Is much of your revenue, very sort of domestically directed? What's the impact of border closures and the like?
For museum entry, there's a decent proportion, 40% from interstate and international tourism. So it has an enormous impact on us in terms of museum entry and exhibition entry. But the domestic market is our strongest for function revenue and for filming opportunities at our venues. So that's slowly coming back in.
Sorry, go ahead, Rose.
Oh, well, I just had a question, Mr. Lindsay, about the...
Nice.
How many times have... We're old friends after the Sarah inquiry. How many times... I just wanted to ask about the interest that you see from visitors, interstate, international, with the historic buildings that Sydney Living Museum manages. I mean, I know you have a suite across Sydney, but is it fair to say that there is quite a lot of community interest in visiting these heritage buildings, visiting these historic buildings and seeing the stories that they're able to bring to life?
I think international visitors, absolutely, and there's a growing interest in pre-colonial history. That feedback came through very strongly from the Hyde Park Barracks, where we, in my opinion, integrate colonial and pre-colonial history in a compelling and respectful way. I think for the domestic market, the challenge is putting new content and new stories in those sites so that they're interested to come back. I think they're interested to come once. Coming back to house museums and historically based museums is the challenge.
I suppose I asked that question because, as you would know, the future of the Willow Grove Historic House on the Parramatta Powerhouse site is a point of contention for this inquiry. And so, there has been quite a lot of feedback that retaining that property, and in some ways, having visited it, is a bit of a blank slate for different exhibitions to move in and out. Retaining that property as a historic house as part of a museum site, would be attractive to visitors.
Look, I'll speak generally rather than specifically about Willow Grove, but I think generally it's difficult to run an historically based house museum. But it depends how dyed-in-the-wool you are on the concept of being place-based. If every story that you tell has to relate strictly to that site and no more, then you're going to find limitations on the amount of new content you can bring through. But if you do see it as a site where you can have a contemporary perspective and can have even contemporary art in a historic site, something like, the Met Cloisters does that well, and I think we've talked about that before, where you get a new appreciation for unrelated but contemporary objects in an historical setting. So if you're more liberal in your interpretation, then yes, I think it can be attractive. If you're more dyed-in-the-wool on the conservative end of that continuum, I think it's a difficult prospect to keep visitors interested in returning.
Indeed, but I think that is a reflection on the type of exhibitions you might hold in the setting, the
Indeed.
house, but having that, if you are a little bit more open-minded about what you might bring in and out, having that place, that house, that framework, those bones, can be a very attractive setting for a range of different exhibitions that attract people.
Look, absolutely, I wouldn't be doing my job properly if I disagreed with that statement. So I completely agree with that statement. But I will say, and this is not a comment about Willow Grove specifically, but if there's not enough capital investment and operational funding to keep something running, you have to make difficult choices about what there is enough money to keep and care for in the optimal way. So I think we are slowly approaching, and in heritage circles and in architecture circles particularly, and a trust responsible for 12 significant budget-hungry properties are talking about, how sustainable is a growing portfolio of these types of places, and what are your A grade, B grade, and C grade places. So, I don't think there's the ability for any types of places like this of significance to grow ad infinitum unless there's the budget line to support them.
Indeed.
And can I just ask in that regard, and sort of the intellectual capital that's available to keep turning over, there's only so many exhibitions you can essentially generate at any one time?
Well, there is. There's infinite stories, and I think the appetite for cultural property and intellectual property is abundant. I know I said I wouldn't speak about New South Wales State Archives, but, if you've got the opportunity to come and see the breadth and depth of material, you could program every house in this country in some way or another with interesting and relevant stories. So I think it's
But
not
we
a matter
don't
of...
for a particular reason. Partly we don't for a particular reason. Partly it's budgetary, isn't it? But
Exactly.
it's also a manpower issue.
Exactly. Look, I think we're heading close to a debate about intrinsic value here. And to me, I think there is intrinsic value, but I don't think that's the primary source of value. It has to be accessible and desirable for people to want to come and see it in an authentic way and in a compelling way for it to have value to the community at large.
I think one of the the sites that Sydney Living Museum manages is obviously the Elizabeth Farm,
Yes.
which is in the Parramatta precinct. And having visited it, it's not a historic building in the sense of, a sort of grand sandstone structure. It's in some ways like Willow Grove, an old house.
Yes.
That Sydney Living Museums has, incredibly beautifully and movingly transformed into a story of the MacArthur family, and then it's the history of Parramatta. And so I suppose having seen the great work that can be done with somewhere like Elizabeth Farm, I'm obviously concerned to lose the opportunity to do something similar with the Willow Grove site and, turn more sites in that Parramatta area, which has so much history that isn't really told,
Yes.
Into something that is really attractive for people in New South Wales to visit.
Absolutely.
Would you care to comment more on the potential of Willow Grove to be another Elizabeth Farm-esque
Yeah.
property in
Look,
a similar area with a similar offering that is similarly fantastic?
Yeah. Look, in theory, yes. I won't. I think it's difficult to say whose history is more relevant and more important. I think the one of Australia's oldest homesteads, where MacArthur spent his final 10 years committed against his will by his own family, has a very, very strong pull for people. Does Willow Grove have the depth of colonial history to carry that off? Possibly, possibly not. So I'd comment in the general sense to say I'm for preserving history and stories, but I think we have to make sure that they are returning value to the community and not just resting on the laurels of intrinsic value being the only motivator.
Chair?
Well,
Any more questions?
Yes.
Ben.
Could I go to the part of the terms of reference that talks about access? You raised the Hyde Park Barracks. The first point I guess I want to make, which I made in a different inquiry, which I'll make again today, is you talked about the balancing of colonial and pre-colonial histories, which I think is done brilliantly and incredibly sympathetically, and I want to congratulate you and commend you for that. One of the things you do that is done at Hyde Park Barracks is focus on access for those who have mobility issues and hearing issues, and I think that's done extremely well. I wonder if you have any suggestions or recommendations that this committee should consider about improving that or what can be done more broadly across the museum sector in New South Wales.
Certainly, access was one of the fundamental principles of the reformation of Hyde Park Barracks. We were fortunate enough to get a Commonwealth Protecting National Historic Sites grant that enabled us to hire Accessible Arts as an access consultant, and the accessibility there is on multiple levels. Firstly, there's accessible pathways all around the site. The natural gravel there is part of the UNESCO World Heritage listing, but it's terrible for access. People with mobility devices, particularly where they're wheel-based, can't really go over them. So the accessible pathways extend right around the building and allow you to see all of the exhibition space. We installed a lift, so for the first time ever, people who can't use stairs, and they're not particularly compliant stairs in the Hyde Park Barracks, can see the second and third floor for the first time. So those kind of physical access attributes were really important. And when we've run public programs, and even on general days when I walk around there, I see so many more people in wheelchairs accessing that site. It's really phenomenal. And they're front and centre for public programs. So you might not know that these small little honeycombs in the gravel, you might not know what they are, but certainly people with mobility devices and wheelchairs particularly see them straight away and gravitate toward the site. So there's some of those overt symbols. And then inside, the story guide has been modified. It's an audio experience, but if you have low vision or are blind, it has descriptive text. If you're hearing impaired or deaf, it has functionality for you to participate as well. So in all aspects, we've considered access, and I would encourage any museum doing any type of significant capital works, or even rehanging their gallery spaces, permanent or temporary, to really seriously think about access and engage experts to advise you.
Yeah, one of the things I noticed, for example, was even where you were able to view exhibits that for people in wheelchairs, it was appropriate and
Yes.
really thoughtful.
Height-wise, and for children as well. It was interesting because one of the other principles for the Hyde Park Barracks was a history museum without text, because our audience research showed that people who are interested in history don't mind coming and reading long swathes of text and label, but people that aren't would prefer other ways in. So it's accessible even for people who may think history's boring or dry. So we really took accessibility in a very broad sense.
The other issue on
Shameful
accessibility...
thought, though.
Sorry?
A shameful thought that history is boring and dry.
Absolutely, I condemn it completely, but I also want the ticket sales from people that do hold that, and so I respect that view and take that
It was
feedback
hot
very
stuff.
strongly.
I appreciate the balance.
The other issue I wanted to raise in terms of accessibility was obviously for regional people.
Yes.
To ask if you had, we've just been through a significant inquiry into Sydney Living Museums and Sarah, but if there was anything you particularly wanted to highlight in terms of what you do and your organisations do in terms of regional access, and if you had any specific recommendations that you'd like to make to this committee in our considerations.
Certainly, I think both Sydney Living Museums, despite its name, and New South Wales State Archives have very extensive regional networks, both physical and through digital access, and through travelling exhibitions that we often subsidise for regional galleries and libraries to be able to have either primary or secondary access to archival material and museum collection material and IP. I think my advice, I suppose, or recommendation is there's not one regional solution. It's like there's not one Indigenous solution. It depends what region, it depends what they're interested in. So I think be open and flexible. And the model we have is where we're touring things outside the state, make enough money to potentially subsidise things that are touring within the state to really fulfil a statewide access mandate.
Mr. Lindsay, I'm sorry to ask this of you, but if you say to somebody the Powerhouse Museum, they know what you're talking about.
Yes.
If you say to somebody the art gallery, they know what they're talking about. When you
Yes.
say to somebody Sydney Living Museums,
Yes.
do you always have to explain what it means?
Not always.
But often?
There are occasions. I mean, I'm not sure what angle you want me to explore. I won't go into brand theory or history of the brand and the name change. What I would say is that constraint and that brand recognition is very real for both New South Wales State Archives and Sydney Living Museums. And it's precisely one of the strong reasons that I'm in support of the creation of a new cultural institution of which SLM and SARA would form part.
Okay, yes, I think I understand what you're saying.
Thank you.
Let's not go into that.
Let's not go into
inquiry.
it, but I am prepared to talk about it if anyone wants to.
Hours, I suspect.
We'll need an extension of time.
Almost, we have run out of time. Thank you very much. Thanks very much for coming, Mr. Lindsay. And thanks very much for your help. And sorry we inconvenienced you before, but that
Not at all.
seems to be the way of this committee sometimes.
Not at all. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We are inconvenienced.